All right, folks, I do not need to remind you what a lonely world it is. There are songs written about this, and it is an epidemic right now. But fortunately, there are ways that people can get together. They don't have to have a relationship that lasts very long. And in this case we're going to talk about today, Gannett was online searching for something fairly casual, and he finds a 19-year-old that says she and her sister want to have some fun. So the way this website worked is that they were really communicating via email. Here they are, like email messaging each other, and eventually Amber, who we know is really a detective, some middle-aged dude pretending to be 19 years old on a website, even sending fake pictures. But Amber says, look, my sister is only 14 years old. Guess what, Gannett was not having any of that. And Gannett was like, well, you and I can get together. You and I need to get together. Amber kept saying, well, what about us? What about us? What about my sister, my 14-year-old? Well, eventually, I think it was 32 emails into this, the detective was like, do you realize that it's gonna be me and my little sis? Gannett responded, well, I'm trying to keep things clean. And Gannett kept steering things away from the minor, but the agent said, hey, I need to know about whether the minor's involved because I need to prep her. And Gannett's like, prep her? What does that consist of? So anyway, Gannett is still a little thrown by all this, but when he's thrown by all this and he steers off course, not wanting the minor, the detective, Amber, says, are you scared to talk about this? Are you afraid, etc., etc.? In the 41st email message, eventually, Gannett finally starts coming around and he asks, is any of this consensual? What's going on? And the undercover's like, oh yeah, this is consensual. And you know where this is going. It looks like what you've seen on TV. To Catch a Predator. Gannett shows up, meets up, and bam, he's arrested, guns drawn. It's a big deal. You got a sex offense, you're going to prison, etc., etc. But Gannett files this appeal and says his case should have been dismissed because he was entrapped. Now, ladies and gentlemen, entrapment is a sticky, tricky legal issue, but what I can tell you is there are steps that we defense attorneys have to take to prove entrapment. The first step is we have to prove that our client was induced. For Gannett, this was easy to do. Gannett handed over the email transcripts. Here you go. Look at the inducement. The court looked at it and said, yeah, you tried to wiggle out of this. You kept saying that you wanted it between you and the 19-year-old. You were trying to keep the minor out of it, and yet they kept bringing the minor back in. So you were very clearly induced. But the second step that we defense attorneys have to prove in a case like this is predisposition. So it's not enough to just say my client was induced to commit this crime. You also have to say, by the way, there is no predisposition to be hanging out with 14-year-old girls. Now, how do we know this? We can prove this because we can establish, for example, there's no investigation into our client for doing this sort of activity. There's no prior arrest for doing this sort of thing. And you got his phone, you probably searched his car, you probably searched his house. And guess what? There's no searching, no evidence that this man has ever looked for a 14-year-old before. And as a matter of fact, the response to the ad was a 19-year-old. So even within the response, there was no predisposition. So once you establish those two things, the burden shifts to the prosecutor. And the prosecutor has to show beyond every reasonable doubt to the court, before the court's going to throw this thing out, that Gannett, without persuasion, was willing and readily able to go out there and try to meet up with a 14-year-old to have sex, okay? They couldn't establish that. They couldn't prove that. So the court said, heck no, we are throwing out his conviction. And they just sort of laid out some of the bare bones, like, look at what law enforcement did here. This is wrong, and we're throwing it out. It's called entrapment. They said, look, the email chain established by a preponderance of the evidence that the government induced and encouraged Gannett, and he had no predisposition to be doing this sort of thing. And they further said that, look, it was the agent that initially suggested the minor. That is very important, folks, okay? Because you didn't have Gannett talking to this 19-year-old going, You got any young friends? Tell me about your young friends. You got some young sisters? No, this was law enforcement bringing up the minor. And even when law enforcement brought up the minor, Gannett was like, I want to talk to you, the 19-year-old. I don't want the minor. So it was the agent, the government, that constantly steered the conversations back to the minor. It was even the government, when Gannett was leaving this whole situation, that the government said, are you scared? Are you afraid? Why aren't you willing to talk about this? Basically, this guy had no predisposition, and the court threw this thing out. This was total entrapment, and the court did the right thing on this case.